The summons. The crystalline spires of Station Eternus pierced the void like frozen lightning, suspended at the gravitational nexus of 7 star systems. For 3,000 cycles, it had served as the seat of the galactic sovereignty, an empire of empires, where species who had conquered their home galaxies gathered to maintain the fragile peace between powers that could shatter worlds. Ambassador Cale Torrance stepped through the matter transmission gate, his boots clicking against floors that seemed carved from solidified starlight. The human delegation had been summoned with unprecedented urgency, and that alone set his nerves on edge. Humanity had joined the sovereignty only 40 standard years ago, still considered newcomers in a chamber where some delegations measured their membership in millennia. "First time at Eternus?" asked his aide, Dr. Sienna Roth, adjusting the translation matrix embedded in her collar. "Third," Cale replied, his gray eyes scanning the vaulted corridors. "But first time called to an emergency convocation. Whatever this is about, it's significant." They were escorted by a Vexian honor guard, beings of pure electromagnetic energy constrained within containment suits that shimmered like oil on water. The guards said nothing, which was typical. The Vexians had transcended verbal communication 8,000 years ago and considered speech a quaint evolutionary remnant. The Grand Chamber was exactly as Cale remembered, a hemisphere of impossible architecture where physics bent to accommodate the diverse environmental needs of its occupants. Sections of the chamber existed in different atmospheric pressures, temperatures, even temporal flows. Gravity itself was negotiable, adjusted to each delegation's comfort. Already assembled were the great powers. The Threnodai Collective occupied the eastern quadrant, their hive mind manifested through 7 identical crystalline avatars that spoke in perfect unison. To the west, the Kyver Dominion, massive, quadrupedal beings whose exoskeletons could withstand the pressure of neutron stars, rested on platforms reinforced with exotic matter. The Ashenter Concordat, beings of living shadow from a dimension humanity's mathematics couldn't fully describe, rippled in their designated zone where light itself seemed uncertain how to behave. And there, presiding from the central dais, was High Arbiter Zelkinth of the Morvathian Assembly, first among equals in the sovereignty. The Morvathians resembled nothing so much as enormous cephalopods, if cephalopods had evolved to manipulate quantum fields as easily as humans breathed. "The human delegation is recognized," Zelkinth's voice emerged from translation nodes positioned throughout the chamber. "Ambassador Torrance, you arrive at a moment of crisis." Cale inclined his head respectfully. "We received the summons, High Arbiter. How may humanity serve the sovereignty?" A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through some delegations. The Kyver representative, War Marshal Drokthan, shifted his massive bulk with a sound like grinding planets. "Serve?" Drokthan's voice was a subsonic rumble felt more than heard. "Your species has been summoned to answer for violations of the Controlled Development Protocols. We do not require your service, we require your compliance." Sienna stiffened beside Cale, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Humanity has scrupulously followed all sovereignty guidelines regarding technological expansion and territorial claims." "Not expansion," hissed the unified voice of the Threnodai Collective. "Corruption. Your species has been distributing prohibited technologies to pre-sovereign civilizations in the outer reaches. The Alvarez, the Shendari. 7 species total, all given access to quantum computing matrices, faster-than-light communication, and defensive shield technology far beyond their natural development curve." The accusation hung in the air like a blade. Around the chamber, lesser delegations, species who owed allegiance to the great powers, watched with undisguised interest. This was unprecedented. Accusations of protocol violation typically happened in closed committees, not open convocation. Cale's mind raced. The charges were true technically. But the context. "We acknowledge providing technological assistance to developing civilizations," he said carefully. "However, these were not violations of protocol. They were humanitarian interventions. Each of those 7 species faced existential threats: asteroid impacts, solar expansion, ecological collapse. We provided the minimum necessary technology to ensure their survival." "The minimum?" The Ashenter delegate emerged from the shadows, its form never quite resolving into a stable shape. "You gave the Alvarez the capability to deflect planetary bodies. The same technology could weaponize asteroids against their enemies, or ours." "We gave them shields," Cale countered. "Defensive technology only. And we provided extensive training and ethical frameworks." "Your frameworks? Your ethics?" Zelkintha's tentacles rippled with bioluminescent patterns that expressed something between pity and disdain. This is precisely why the controlled development protocols exist, Ambassador. Young species are notoriously blind to the consequences of their generosity. You see 7 civilizations saved from extinction. We see the seeds of 7 future wars, 7 potential insurgencies against the order we have maintained for 3 millennia. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of environmental systems. Kale could feel the weight of ancient empires pressing down on him, species who had learned through countless catastrophes that mercy and wisdom rarely aligned. The Sovereignty Council has voted, Zelkinth continued. Humanity will cease all contact with pre-sovereign civilizations immediately. Your exploratory vessels will be confined to sovereign space. Your diplomatic corps will be reduced by 70%. And your species will enter a probationary period of 500 cycles, during which your voting privileges in this chamber are suspended. 500 years. Effectively permanent by human timescales. And if we refuse? The words left Kale's mouth before he could stop them. Every being in the chamber turned their attention to the human delegation. The temperature seemed to drop despite the environmental controls. Refuse? Drokthan leaned forward, his massive head filling Kale's vision. Young human, do you understand what you propose? Kale met the War Marshal's multifaceted gaze without flinching. Behind him he could feel Sienna's barely controlled panic, but there was no backing down now. I propose that we discuss this decision, he said quietly, before it becomes irreversible. The price of mercy. The silence in the grand chamber stretched like a physical thing, pressing against Kale's chest with the weight of civilizations far older than humanity's written history. He could see the calculation in Zelkintha's bioluminescent patterns. This newcomer species, barely a cosmic infant, daring to question the consensus of empires. There is nothing to discuss, the Threnodai collective intoned, their 7 avatars speaking as one crystalline chorus. The council has voted. The matter is settled. Your protocol's violation endangered the stability we have cultivated across 3,000 cycles. Endangered. Kale stepped forward, ignoring Sienna's sharp intake of breath. High Arbiter, honored delegates, I must speak plainly. With respect to this council's wisdom, I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding of humanity's actions. We understand perfectly, the Ashenter shadow form rippled. You acted on emotion rather than calculation. Compassion without wisdom. It is the failing of all young species. Kale shook his head. No. We acted on principle, one that apparently differs from the Sovereignty's core philosophy. Tell me, when the Alvarez star began its death cycle ahead of projections, how long would it have taken this council to authorize intervention? Zelkintha's tentacles curled inward slightly, a Morvathian gesture of consideration. The Controlled Development Committee would have required approximately 20 standard years to evaluate the situation, determine appropriate intervention levels and implement. 20 years, Kale interrupted, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. The Alvarez had 18 months before their world became uninhabitable. We received their distress signal, crude radio waves barely coherent, and faced a choice. Wait for this council to deliberate while 15 billion sentient beings died or act. You chose chaos over order, War Marshal Drokthan rumbled. Noble sentiment. Catastrophic precedent. Did we? Kale turned to address the assembled delegations, his voice strengthening. 7 species. Let's examine the chaos we supposedly unleashed. The Alvarez used our shield technology to create orbital habitats and successfully evacuated their planet. They're now thriving in a new system we helped them reach. The Shandari stopped their asteroid using our deflection matrices, not to weaponize but to mine. They now have resources to feed their population for 1,000 years. Where is the chaos? Where is the catastrophe? You are young, the Threnodai spoke with something approaching patience. You do not see the patterns. We have witnessed this cycle countless times. A species is given power beyond their wisdom to wield. At first they use it benevolently. Then comes the schism, ideological, religious, territorial. The gifts become weapons. The saviors become conquerors. It is inevitable. Inevitable? Sienna spoke for the first time, her voice sharp. Or a self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect them to fail, so you provide no guidance, no partnership, no hope. When they struggle in isolation, you point and say, see, we were right. A murmur rippled through the lesser delegations. Kale noticed several species exchanging glances, the Korthari, the Velshera, the Mendari. All of them relatively young members of the Sovereignty, still remembered what it felt like to stand where humanity stood now. Zelkintha's bioluminescence shifted to deeper purples, displeasure but also intrigue. You speak boldly for a species facing sanction. Do you truly not comprehend the consequences of refusing our judgment? We comprehend them perfectly, High Arbiter. Kale's voice was steady now, calm. You will restrict our movement, reduce our voice, perhaps even expel us from the sovereignty entirely. You have the power to do all of this. But answer me one question, will that stop us? The chamber erupted. Delegates from a dozen species began speaking at once, their translation matrices creating a cacophony of overlapping voices. Drakhthan rose to his full height, his exoskeleton crackling with contained energy. You dare threaten. Not a threat, War Marshal. A statement of fact. Kale stood his ground even as the massive Kyver loomed above him. Humanity didn't join the sovereignty to gain permission to be ourselves. We joined because we believed in a community of civilizations, working together toward mutual flourishing. But if the price of membership is watching sentient beings die when we have the power to save them, then that price is too high. You would choose exile over obedience? Zelkinth asked quietly. We would choose principle over politics, Kale replied. Every time. Without hesitation. The High Arbiter regarded him for a long moment, tentacles undulating in complex patterns that Kale's translation matrix couldn't fully interpret. Then Zelkinth turned to address the full assembly. This is precisely why the young species are dangerous, the High Arbiter said, but there was something in the tone that made Kale pause. They cling to absolutes in a universe of compromise. They see situations in binary terms, save or abandon, act or abstain. They have not yet learned that survival requires flexibility. Or perhaps, a new voice entered the debate, they remember what we have forgotten. Every head, or equivalent sensory apparatus, turned toward the western quadrant. There, in a section of the chamber Kale had barely noticed, sat a delegation he didn't recognize. 3 beings, vaguely humanoid but with skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their representatives stood slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of extreme age. The Praeth sovereignty recognizes Elder Counselor Vironen of the Lumini Remnant, Zelkinth announced, and for the first time, Kale heard something like reverence in the High Arbiter's voice. Vironen moved to the chamber floor, each step measured. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of eons. I have sat in this chamber for 900 cycles, Vironen said. I have seen species rise and fall. I have watched empires that seemed eternal crumble to dust. And I have learned that the greatest danger to any civilization is not chaos, it is forgetting why we chose to survive in the first place. He turned to face Kale directly. Young human, your species' actions were reckless. Ill-considered. They ignored protocols established through painful experience. And yet, Viroenen's ancient eyes seemed to look through Kale, past him, to something distant. They were also correct. The chamber exploded in protest, but Viroenen raised one hand, and silence fell like a hammer. 3,000 cycles ago, the sovereignty was founded on a different principle than the one we practice today. We were not always so cautious, so calculating. There was a time when we believed that power should serve life, not merely regulate it. We seem to have lost our way. Elder Counselor, Zelkinth began, tentacles curling with obvious discomfort, the protocols exist because we became afraid, Vironen interrupted gently. Afraid of change. Afraid of risk. Afraid of the very dynamism that once defined us. We transformed from a sovereignty of purpose into a bureaucracy of stagnation. The ancient precedent. Elder Counselor Viroenen's words hung in the air like a judgment passed down from history itself. Around the Grand Chamber, delegations that had been united in condemnation of humanity moments before now exchanged uncertain glances. The Lumini Remnant held a unique position in the sovereignty. They were the only founding species still active in galactic politics, the last living link to the ideals that had birthed this union of empires. Kale watched as Zelkintha's bioluminescence flickered through a rapid sequence of colors. Surprise, consternation, calculation. The High Arbiter was clearly unprepared for this intervention. Elder Counselor, Zelkinth said carefully, with all respect to your species' contributions to the sovereignty's foundation, the protocols we discuss were implemented specifically to prevent the catastrophes our early, more impulsive interventions caused. Surely you remember the Thendril incident? The Cascade Wars of the Outer Rim? I remember them quite well, Vironen replied, his voice carrying the weight of personal witnessing. I was there when the Thendril civilization collapsed after receiving military technology from the Kyver Dominion, offered not out of compassion but as part of a proxy war against the Vexians. I watched 17 billion beings die in conflicts they never sought and barely understood. War Marshal Drocthan's exoskeleton darkened, the Kyver equivalent of shame. That was a different age. Different leadership. We have evolved beyond such. You have evolved into paralysis, Vironin interrupted, not unkindly. And therein lies the distinction the Council seems unable to grasp. The Thendro catastrophe happened because the Kyver gave weapons to manipulate, not tools to survive. They created a dependency, then exploited it. The humans did something entirely different. He turned back to Kale. Ambassador Torrance, please correct me if I misunderstand your species' actions. When you provided technology to the Alvarez, did you maintain control over its implementation? No, Elder Counselor, Kale replied, understanding where this was leading. We provided the knowledge, training, and initial materials. But the Alvarez built their own shield generators, programmed their own navigation systems, made their own decisions about who to evacuate first, which artifacts of their culture to preserve, which stars to flee toward. And did you demand anything in return? Resources? Allegiance? Territory? Nothing. We asked only that they remember who helped them, and that if they encountered others in need, they consider doing the same. Vryn nodded slowly. Pay forward the mercy shown to you. A human concept, I believe? This, paying it forward? An old one, yes, Sienna confirmed. The idea that kindness can cascade, creating networks of mutual support rather than hierarchies of obligation. Networks of mutual support, Vryn repeated, and now his voice took on a harder edge as he addressed the assembly. When did we abandon this principle? When did the sovereignty transform from a community of species committed to collective flourishing into a rigid hierarchy that values order over life? The Threnodai Collective's 7 avatars chimed in dissonant harmony. Elder Counselor, you oversimplify a complex evolution. The protocols exist because uncontrolled intervention breeds dependency. We have seen it repeatedly. You have seen what you expected to see, Vryn encountered. Confirmation bias wearing the mask of wisdom. Yes, some species failed when given too much too quickly. But how many succeeded that you never counted? How many civilizations developed in isolation simply because we lacked the courage to offer a hand? He moved to the center of the chamber, and despite his species' diminutive size compared to beings like the Kyver, he commanded absolute attention. Let me share a truth the Council has conveniently forgotten. When the Morvathians first achieved faster-than-light travel, they were dying. A plague swept through their home system, one their biology could not resist. They broadcast desperate pleas into the void, hoping anyone might hear. Zelkintha's tentacles went rigid. Elder Counselor, that history is classified? Inconvenient. Vryn's eyes glinted. The Lumini heard their plea. We had the cure, a simple genetic therapy by our standards. And we faced exactly the debate happening now. Some among my people argued we should let nature take its course. That interference would corrupt the Morvathians' development. That compassion without earned wisdom leads to catastrophe. The chamber was utterly silent now. Even the environmental systems seemed to have hushed, as if the station itself was listening. But others argued differently, Vryn continued. They said that if we possessed the power to prevent suffering and chose not to act, we became complicit in that suffering. That wisdom without compassion is merely sophisticated cruelty. That the only meaningful difference between civilization and barbarism is whether we help those who cannot help themselves. He turned in a slow circle, addressing each delegation in turn. The Lumini chose compassion. We gave the Morvathians the cure freely, asking nothing in return. And yes, there were complications. Cultural disruptions. Economic adjustments. The Morvathians struggled with the knowledge that they owed their survival to alien intervention. Some resented us. Some worshipped us. It took them 3 generations to process the gift and find their own path forward. Zelkintha's bioluminescence had shifted to a deep violet Kale had never seen before, and color that registered on his translation matrix as profound discomfort mixed with something else. Gratitude? Shame? But they did find their path, Vryn said softly. They became one of the sovereignty's most dedicated members. They helped draft the founding charter. And yes, eventually they were the ones who proposed the controlled development protocols, because they remembered how overwhelming it was to be on the receiving end of help they hadn't earned and couldn't reciprocate. Then you prove our point, the Ascenter delegate hissed from its shadow realm. The protocols exist because even successful interventions create trauma. No, Vryn said firmly. The protocols exist because we lost our nerve. Because it's easier to hide behind bureaucracy than to make difficult moral choices. Because saving lives is messy and unpredictable, and we've become addicted to control. He locked eyes with Kale across the chamber. Ambassador Torrance, I have a question for you. When the Alvarez sent their distress signal and you detected it, how did humanity decide to respond? Was it a governmental mandate? A military order? Kale felt a warmth in his chest. Pride, yes, but also the memory of something extraordinary. No, Elder Counselor. It was spontaneous. The signal was detected by a civilian research vessel, the Wanderer's Dream. Captain Marissa Chen brought it to her crew's attention. They voted, 43 people on a science ship, and unanimously agreed to divert from their mission to investigate. By the time the vote reached Earth's government, 3 more civilian vessels had already changed course to assist. The government's role was simply to coordinate what was already happening. Your species acted collectively without coercion, Vironin said, and now there was unmistakable approval in his voice. Not because you were ordered but because you chose to. This is the principle the sovereignty was founded upon, not obedience to protocol, but voluntary dedication to mutual flourishing. War Marshal Drochthan shifted his massive bulk, the sound like tectonic plates grinding. Pretty words, Elder Counselor. But words do not change reality. If we abandon the protocols, chaos will follow. Species will intervene recklessly. Good intentions will pave the road to catastrophic wars. Perhaps, Vironin acknowledged. But I would rather risk chaos born of compassion than enforce order built on indifference. At least the former honors what we claim to be. He turned back to Zelkinth. High Arbiter, I invoke the right of historical precedent. Under the founding charter of the sovereignty, any member species may call for a re-vote on council decisions if they can demonstrate those decisions contradict the sovereignty's foundational principles. A shockwave of surprise rippled through the assembly. The right of historical precedent hadn't been invoked in over 1,000 cycles. The turning tide. The invocation of the right of historical precedent transformed the Grand Chamber's atmosphere instantaneously. What had been a formal disciplinary hearing now became something far more volatile. A constitutional crisis that struck at the very heart of the sovereignty's identity. Zelkinth's tentacles coiled and uncoiled in rapid succession, bioluminescence flickering through patterns that Kale's translation matrix struggled to interpret. Finally, the High Arbiter spoke, each word carefully measured. Elder Counselor Vironin, you understand what you've initiated? The right of historical precedent requires a full constitutional review. Every founding species must vote. The process could take cycles. Then we begin immediately, Vironin replied calmly. Or do you intend to argue that humanity's case doesn't merit such consideration? It was a masterful trap. To deny the right would be to admit the sovereignty had strayed from its founding principles. To accept it meant opening everything to scrutiny, not just humanity's actions but the entire framework of protocols built over 3 millennia. The right is valid, Zelkinth conceded, though the word seemed to pain him. But while the constitutional review proceeds, the sanctions against humanity remain in effect. That is standard procedure. Standard procedure written by those who feared challenge, Vironin countered. I propose an alternative. Let humanity continue their work, unrestricted, while we deliberate. Let their actions speak for themselves. If the chaos predicted by the Council manifests, you'll have your proof. If it doesn't, he left the implication hanging. Absolutely not, the Threnodai collective chimed in unified outrage. That would be sanctioning the very behavior we've condemned. It would be demonstrating trust, interrupted a new voice, one Kale hadn't heard before. A delegation from the northern quadrant stirred, the Korthari Confederation, a species that resembled crystalline arachnids, their translucent bodies refracting light into prismatic patterns. Their representative, Matriarch Silas, extended several limbs in what Kale's cultural database identified as a gesture of tentative support. The Korthari were admitted to the sovereignty only 200 cycles ago, Silas clicked, her words translated into smooth Federation standard. We remember clearly what it felt like to be the young species in this chamber. To be lectured about patience by civilizations that have forgotten what urgency feels like. Matriarch Silas, Zelkinth began, a warning note in his voice, your perspective is valued but you'd prefer we remember our place? Silas interrupted, her crystalline body flashing with agitated colors. This is exactly what Elder Counselor Vironin addresses. We have created a hierarchy where age equals wisdom, where caution is valued above all else. When the Korthari first applied for sovereignty membership, we were told we lacked sufficient maturity. Do you know what we lacked, High Arbiter? We lacked cynicism. She skittered to the chamber floor, her multiple legs clicking against the luminous surface. We believed that a sovereignty of advanced civilizations would be a force for good in the galaxy. We imagined collaborative science, shared resources, mutual defense against existential threats. Instead, we found bureaucracy. Committees that take decades to authorize the most basic humanitarian aid. Protocols that prioritize paperwork over lives. Matriarch, you overstep, War Marshal Drokthan began, but Celis whirled on him with surprising ferocity. Do I, War Marshal? Tell me, when the Helion Nebula began collapsing 3 cycles ago, threatening to destroy the Chandrix homeworld, how long did it take the Emergency Response Committee to authorize intervention? Drokthan's silence was damning. 41 standard months, Celis answered her own question. During which the Chandrix evacuated 30% of their population into sublight generation ships, believing they'd been abandoned by the galaxy's great powers. By the time we acted, the crisis had already resolved, not through our wisdom but through their desperation. The Chandrix situation was complex. The Ashenter delegate protested, its shadow form writhing with agitation. Multiple jurisdictional questions, resource allocation disputes, environmental impact assessments. Excuses, Sienna interjected, unable to contain herself. You're describing reasons why it's hard to save lives, as if that justifies not trying. The chamber erupted again, but this time Kale noticed something different. The lesser delegations, species like the Korthari, the Velshera, the Mendari, were no longer sitting in silent deference. They were engaging, arguing, some even nodding in agreement with Sienna's blunt assessment. Zelkinth raised several tentacles, calling for order. This debate grows increasingly tangential. We are here to address humanity's specific violations, not to relitigate the entire sovereignty framework. But they're inseparable, Kale interjected, his voice cutting through the noise. High Arbiter, with respect, you've made them inseparable. By framing humanity's actions as violations rather than moral choices, you've forced us to question whether the protocols themselves are just. He stepped fully into the chamber's center, addressing the entire assembly now. Every species in this chamber achieved greatness through risk. The Morvathians explored dangerous dimensional rifts to develop their quantum manipulation technology. The Kyver survived 1,000 years of brutal evolution on a high-gravity death world. The Vexians transcended physical form through experiments that killed billions before succeeding. You all took extraordinary risks because the alternative was stagnation or extinction. Kale's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But now you want to deny that same opportunity to others. You want them to develop, naturally, which apparently means slowly, inefficiently, with maximum suffering. You've created a galaxy where only those who already have power get to decide who else deserves it. You simplify complex realities, the Threnodai said, but there was less certainty in their unified voice now. Do I? Then explain the selection criteria for sovereignty membership. Explain why species must achieve faster-than-light travel independently before you'll even acknowledge their existence. Explain why a civilization capable of quantum computing, genetic engineering, and sustainable fusion might still be too primitive for contact because they haven't stumbled onto one specific technology. The FTO requirement ensures a minimum technological baseline, Zelkinth began. It ensures that only species who develop exactly like you did get a seat at the table, Kale countered. It's not wisdom, it's narcissism. You've created a club of civilizations who all share the same developmental path, then congratulate yourselves on your diversity while excluding anyone who took a different route. A Velshera delegate, resembling a serpentine being of flowing mercury, raised their voice for the first time. The human speaks truth we've been afraid to voice. My species developed advanced biotechnology and genetic mastery 1,000 years before achieving FTL. We could have cured diseases, extended lifespans, transformed our entire civilization. But we held back, terrified that if we progressed too fast in the wrong areas, the sovereignty would deem us unworthy of contact. We wasted a millennium, the Velshera continued, their metallic form rippling with emotion. 1,000 years of preventable suffering because we were trying to fit your template rather than following our own path. How many beings died in that time? How much knowledge was delayed? And for what? So we could prove we were ready for membership in a club that values conformity over innovation. More voices joined now, a cascade of younger species, each adding their own grievances, their own stories of how the sovereignty's protocols had cost lives and stifled progress in the name of proper development. Kale watched Elder Counselor Vironin, who stood silent and still, the faintest smile on his ancient face. This was what he'd intended, not just to defend humanity, but to crack open a conversation the sovereignty had been avoiding for centuries. War Marshal Drakthon rose to his full, towering height, and his voice boomed across the chamber with enough force to silence the growing rebellion. Enough. The Kyver's exoskeleton crackled with barely contained energy. You young species speak of our protocols as if they were arbitrary cruelty, but you know nothing of the horrors we've seen. Nothing of the wars, the genocides, the civilizations that destroyed themselves because they reached too far too fast. He turned his massive head toward Kale, multifaceted eyes gleaming. You want to know why we require FTL capability before contact? Because it ensures a species has achieved sufficient unity and technological sophistication to survive knowledge of the wider galaxy. Species that learn they're not alone too early often tear themselves apart. Religious schisms, ideological collapses, existential despair at discovering they're not the universe's chosen children. The price of progress. War Marshal Drakthon's words echoed through the Grand Chamber, and Kale felt their weight. This wasn't the bluster of a bureaucrat defending policy. This was the testimony of a being who had witnessed genuine catastrophe. I have lived for 1800 standard years, Drakthon continued, his voice dropping to something almost resembling gentleness. I have watched civilizations blossom with such promise, only to wither when confronted with realities they weren't prepared to face. The Corventhi, the Thale, the Meridian Collective. Dozens more whose names you've never heard because they destroyed themselves before achieving even rudimentary space travel. The War Marshal's massive form moved through the chamber, and despite his size, there was a profound sadness in his movements. The Corventhi were a beautiful species, poets, artists, philosophers. They had just developed radio astronomy when they detected our communications. Not a first contact, just ambient chatter between Kyver mining operations and their neighboring system. Within 6 planetary rotations, their entire civilization had collapsed into chaos. Riots, wars, mass suicides. They couldn't reconcile their religious beliefs with the reality of a universe full of life. He paused, and Kale saw something he hadn't expected in those alien eyes: grief. We tried to help them, Drakthon said quietly. Sent diplomatic missions. Offered counseling. Cultural exchange programs. Nothing worked. The knowledge of our existence was poison to their civilization. Within a generation they'd regressed to pre-industrial barbarism. Within 3 they were extinct. The last Corventhi died cursing my name, blaming us for destroying their innocence. The chamber was silent. Even the environmental system seemed muted. So you ask why we have protocols? Drakthon's voice hardened again. Because I have held dying beings in my arms who begged me to undo first contact. Because I have walked through the ruins of civilizations that destroyed themselves trying to leap too quickly to technologies they couldn't integrate. Because I have learned that mercy without wisdom is just another form of violence. Kale felt Sienna's hand briefly touch his shoulder, a gesture of support, but also warning. This was the strongest argument against humanity's position, delivered with the authority of lived experience. But Vierwenen stepped forward again, his ancient voice cutting through the emotional weight Drakthon had created. War Marshal, your pain is real. Your losses are genuine. But you've drawn the wrong lesson from them. Drakthon's head swiveled toward the elder counselor, surprise evident despite the alien features. The Corventhi didn't fail because they learned of our existence, Vierwenen said. They failed because they learned of it accidentally, without context, without guidance, without preparation. You didn't choose to contact them, they stumbled onto your communications. And when you tried to help afterward, you were managing a crisis, not nurturing development. Vierwenen's eyes swept the chamber. This is the fundamental flaw in our current protocols. We've chosen between 2 extremes, complete isolation or emergency intervention. We've forgotten there's a middle path: partnership. Partnership with species who lack the framework to understand what we're offering? The Threnodai collective chimed skeptically. Partnership precisely because they lack that framework, Kale interjected, seizing the opening Vierwenen had created. War Marshal Drakthon, the tragedy of the Corventhi wasn't that they learned about aliens. It was that they learned about them alone, without anyone to help them process that revelation. He moved closer to the towering Kyver, unafraid despite the size difference. Humans have a concept called cultural shock, the psychological disorientation that occurs when someone is immersed in an unfamiliar culture. We've studied it extensively because human civilizations have been encountering each other for thousands of years. And we've learned that the shock isn't fatal if the person has guides, teachers, friends who can help them navigate the unfamiliar while maintaining connection to the familiar. The Alvarez weren't alone when we contacted them, Sienna added. We didn't just drop technology and disappear. We sent cultural liaisons, psychologists, educators. We helped them understand not just the tools we were giving them, but the universe they were entering. We prepared them. For 18 months, the Ashenter delegate hissed. A cosmic eye blink. You assumed that's sufficient preparation for realities that took us millennia to accept. We assume nothing, Kale replied. We know it's insufficient. That's why we didn't leave. We're still there, not as rulers or supervisors but as partners. Answering questions. Sharing experiences. Learning from them even as they learn from us. He turned to address the full assembly now, his voice passionate. This is what the sovereignty has lost. You've become so afraid of contamination that you've forgotten the power of genuine exchange. You don't want partners, you want species who've already solved all their problems independently so you can congratulate them on becoming just like you. That is unfair, Zelkinth began, but Kale was on a roll now. Is it? Then tell me about the sovereignty's mentorship programs. The cultural exchange initiatives. The gradual integration pathways for species who show promise but haven't hit every checkbox on your list. They don't exist, do they? Because you're not interested in helping civilizations grow, you're interested in admitting civilizations that have already grown in precisely the ways you approve of. A Mendari delegate, resembling a cluster of luminescent fungi arranged in vaguely humanoid form, spoke up in a voice like wind through leaves. The human ambassador makes a point we've long considered. The Mendari achieved consciousness only 600 cycles ago, yesterday by sovereignty standards. We developed collective intelligence through symbiotic networking, not individual cognition. By traditional standards, we shouldn't even be classified as sentient because we don't think like you do. The Mendari's bioluminescence pulsed with what Kale's database suggested was sardonic amusement. We were admitted to the sovereignty only because we happened to stumble onto FTL through our unique approach to quantum entanglement, using organic neural networks rather than mechanical computers. But if we developed any other way, we'd still be classified as interesting fauna rather than people. Our existence proves the arbitrariness of your criteria. The criteria are not arbitrary, the Threnodai collective protested. They're based on demonstrable capabilities. Based on your capabilities, the Mendari interrupted. Your ways of thinking. Your approaches to problem solving. You've created a sovereignty that only welcomes species who've independently reinvented your wheels, then wonder why there's so little genuine diversity in this chamber. Kale saw his opening. This is exactly why humanity's approach is better. We don't wait for species to become like us. We meet them where they are and help them become the best version of themselves. The Alvarez won't develop into humans. The Shendari won't become human colonies. They'll become fully realized versions of their own species, but they'll get there faster and with less suffering because we were willing to help. And if they use what you've given them to hurt others? Drokthan demanded. What then, Ambassador? When the Alvarez perfect your shield technology into weapons and turn them against their neighbors, will you accept responsibility for those deaths? Yes. The word came from Kale without hesitation. If our help leads to harm, we'll own that consequence. But we refuse to adopt the coward's philosophy that doing nothing is somehow morally superior to trying and failing. The accusation, calling the sovereignty's caution cowardice, landed like a physical blow. Delegations erupted in protest, but Kale pressed on, his voice rising above the din. You've built an empire of non-intervention and called it wisdom. You've watched countless civilizations struggle and die while you debated protocols and assessed readiness. How many species have gone extinct while waiting for your committees to authorize aid? How many innovations were lost because their creators died before independently achieving FTL? How much knowledge, art, philosophy, and beauty has been erased from the universe because you were too afraid to extend a hand? How dare you? Multiple voices began, but Elder Counselor Viernen raised his hand again and silence fell. The ambassador dares because he's right, Viernen said quietly. Not entirely right, there are legitimate concerns about intervention. But right that we've become paralyzed by our own caution. Right that we've confused inaction with wisdom. Right that we've built a system that protects us from the discomfort of difficult choices by simply choosing nothing. Zelkintha's bioluminescence had shifted to deep oranges and reds, colors Kale's matrix translated as profound internal conflict. Elder Counselor Ambassador Torrance, honored delegates, the High Arbiter said slowly. I believe we may have lost sight of our purpose. Not entirely. Not irreversibly. But perhaps enough to warrant serious reflection. It was the closest thing to an admission Kale had expected to hear. The right of historical precedent is affirmed, Zelkinth continued. We will conduct a full constitutional review of the controlled development protocols. But War Marshal Drochthan's concerns are not invalid. We need safeguards, guidance, wisdom to temper compassion. Then let humanity provide the test case, VRNN proposed. Lift the sanctions. Allow them to continue their work with pre-sovereign civilizations, but with sovereignty oversight. Send observers. Require reports. Create accountability without paralysis. A probationary partnership, Matriarch Silas clicked with apparent approval. They act with our knowledge but not our permission. We watch, learn, and adjust based on actual outcomes rather than theoretical fears. The chamber buzzed with debate as delegations conferred among themselves. The grand bargain. The grand chamber had transformed from a courtroom into something resembling a negotiation floor. Delegations huddled in their designated quadrants, engaged in rapid internal debates. Translation matrices created a symphony of overlapping voices, clicks, hums, subsonic rumbles, and crystalline chimes all blending into organized chaos. Kale stood with Sienna at the human delegation's position, watching the deliberations with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They'd come here expecting condemnation and exile. Now they were witnessing something unprecedented, the sovereignty reconsidering its foundational assumptions. We actually did it, Sienna whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. We made them question 3,000 years of policy. Virwenen made them question it, Kale corrected. We just provided the catalyst. Without his intervention, we'd be packing for exile, Sienna finished. But Kale, even if they accept VRYNN's compromise, we're talking about sovereignty oversight. Observers on every mission. Reports on every decision. They'll be watching for us to fail. Let them watch, Kale replied. We've got nothing to hide. And frankly, some oversight isn't the worst idea. We have been moving fast. A second opinion, even a skeptical one, might prevent mistakes. Zelkinth's voice boomed across the chamber, calling for order. The various delegations settled, and Kale could feel the weight of attention focus back on the center floor. The council has deliberated, the High Arbiter announced. Elder Counselor VRNN's proposal for a probationary partnership has support, but concerns remain. War Marshal Drochthan, you wish to speak? The massive Kyver moved to the chamber's center, his exoskeleton gleaming under the ambient light. The Kyver Dominion has reservations, Drochthan said carefully, but also recognition that our current approach may be insufficient. We propose amendments to the Elder Counselor's framework. He turned to address Kale directly. Humanity would be permitted to continue intervention with pre-sovereign civilizations, but under the following conditions. First, a joint review board composed of both human and sovereignty representatives must approve any intervention before it begins. Second, sovereignty observers will be embedded in all human missions. Third, a comprehensive impact assessment will be conducted every standard cycle to evaluate outcomes. Fourth, if any intervention produces measurably negative consequences, violence, cultural dissolution, technological dependence, humanity's probationary status will be immediately revoked and full sanctions reimposed. Kale considered the terms. They were strict, certainly, more bureaucracy than humanity preferred. But they were also workable, and more importantly, they represented genuine compromise rather than capitulation. The Kyver's amendments are reasonable, VRNN interjected before Kale could respond. But I would add a fifth condition. The sovereignty must also evaluate its own protocols during this probationary period. If humanity's interventions prove successful, the Council agrees to consider expanding similar programs with other member species participating. You would have us all become interventionists? The Threnodai collective chimed with evident alarm. I would have us all remember what it means to be a community rather than a bureaucracy, Virwenen replied. Humanity serves as the test case, yes, but for a larger question about who we are and what we stand for. The Ashenter delegate emerged from its shadow realm, its form coalescing into something almost solid. The Ashenter Concordat has a concern. If humanity's interventions succeed, we accept that our protocols may need revision. But if they fail, if their compassion breeds catastrophe, humanity alone must bear the consequences. We will not have the entire sovereignty destabilized by one species' recklessness. Fair, Kale said before anyone else could speak. If our approach fails, we accept full responsibility. But we'd want the same standard applied in reverse. If we succeed, the sovereignty must genuinely reconsider its policies, not just offer token acknowledgement before returning to business as usual. Zelkintha's tentacles wove through a complex pattern that Kale's translation matrix identified as deep contemplation. A binding agreement, the High Arbiter mused. Success or failure determined by objective metrics with real consequences either way. It has potential. But who determines success? By what measurements? I propose a mixed commission, Matriarch Celis clicked, her crystalline body refracting light as she moved to join the discussion. Representatives from humanity, the founding species, and 3 younger member species. We evaluate based on multiple criteria: survival rates, cultural stability, technological integration, independent development milestones, and, critically, the will of the intervened species themselves. You would give pre-sovereign civilizations a voice in evaluating our interventions? The Threnodai sounded genuinely confused by the concept. Why not? Sienna interjected. They're the ones most affected. Seems logical to ask them if our help was actually helpful. The Mendari support this approach, the fungal delegate stated. We remember when the sovereignty evaluated our readiness for membership without ever asking us what we wanted or needed. It was unsettling. To be judged by standards we didn't fully understand, by beings who never sought our perspective. Drakthon rumbled thoughtfully. A radical proposal. But perhaps useful. Very well. The Kyber Dominion agrees to a mixed evaluation commission, with the caveat that final authority rests with the Sovereignty Council. We will consider the opinions of pre-sovereign civilizations, but they cannot have binding votes on policies that affect the entire galactic community. Acceptable, Kale agreed. We're not trying to overthrow the sovereignty's authority, just ensure that authority is exercised with wisdom and compassion. Pretty words, the Ashenter hissed. But we require one more guarantee. If humanity's interventions create conflicts, if these uplifted species turn their new capabilities against each other or against sovereignty members, humanity must commit to resolving those conflicts. You will not be permitted to create problems and walk away. Kale felt a chill. That was a potentially enormous commitment, one that could drag humanity into policing roles across dozens of star systems. But Virwanin spoke before Kale could voice his concerns. The Ashenter's requirement is just, but it must be proportional. Humanity cannot be held responsible for every conflict involving species they've assisted. That would be impossible. But they should be expected to participate in conflict resolution efforts, providing mediation and support. We can agree to that, Kale said, relief evident in his voice. We're not looking to be galaxy police, but we're willing to help clean up our messes. Zelkinth raised several tentacles, calling for formal attention. Let the record show that the following framework has emerged from this unprecedented deliberation. Humanity's sanctions are suspended pending a probationary period of 50 standard cycles. During this time, humanity may conduct interventions with pre-sovereign civilizations subject to joint approval boards and sovereignty observation. A mixed commission will evaluate outcomes based on comprehensive metrics including input from the intervened species themselves. Success leads to broader policy reformation. Failure results in humanity's immediate sanction and potential expulsion from the sovereignty. The High Arbiter's bioluminescence shifted to formal golds, the color of binding agreements. All delegations with voting privileges indicate your position. What followed was a tense sequence as each major power registered their stance. The Lumini Remnant, support. The Morvathian Assembly, support with reservations. The Kyber Dominion, support with conditions. The Vexian Collective, support. The Threnodai Collective, abstention. The Ashenter Concordat, support conditional on strict oversight. Down the line it went through all the founding species and major powers. When the count finished, the result was clear. The framework had passed with overwhelming support. Kale felt Sienna grip his arm, her eyes bright with emotions she was barely containing. The council has spoken, Zelkinth announced. Humanity's probationary partnership is approved. Ambassador Torrance, Dr. Roth, your species has been given an extraordinary opportunity and an extraordinary burden. I trust you understand the weight of what has been decided here today. We do, High Arbiter, Kale replied, keeping his voice steady despite the euphoria threatening to break through. And we're grateful, not just for the opportunity but for the dialogue. For being heard. Do not make us regret this mercy, Drakthon rumbled, but there was something in his tone that wasn't quite threatening. Perhaps respect? Or at least, acknowledgement. We won't, Kale promised. Virwanin approached the human delegation, his ancient eyes twinkling with something that might have been satisfaction. You've accomplished more in one session than most species manage in centuries, the elder counselor said quietly. But the real work begins now. You've claimed that compassion can be systematic, that intervention can be wise. Now you must prove it. We will, Sienna said. And Elder Counselor, thank you. Without your support. I supported the truth, not your species, Viranen interrupted gently. But you spoke that truth boldly when others wouldn't. That counts for something. As the formal session concluded and delegations began to disperse, Kale noticed several younger species approaching. The Korthari, the Velshera, the Mendari, and others. Matriarch Celis was the first to speak. Ambassador Torrance, the Korthari Confederation would like to request human participation in a development initiative we've been planning. We've identified 3 pre-sovereign civilizations in our neighboring sectors who could benefit from assistance. With your permission, we'd like to study your methodology. Of course, Kale replied, surprised but pleased. We're not interested in keeping our approach secret. Honestly, we'd love to collaborate. As would the Velshera, their delegate interjected. We have biotechnology that could revolutionize medical care for developing species, but we've been hesitant to offer it because of the protocols. If humanity's model proves viable. It's a partnership, Sienna said warmly. We help each other help others. That's the whole point. What started as a brief post-session conversation evolved into an impromptu coalition meeting. Species after species approached, sharing their own ideas for intervention programs, their own frustrations with the old protocols, their own hopes for what the sovereignty could become. Kale watched it unfold with growing wonder. They'd come here to defend humanity's actions. They were leaving having sparked a movement. Seeds of change. 3 standard months later, Kale stood on the observation deck of the human vessel Compassion's Edge, watching the Alvarez homeworld grow larger in the viewport. The planet they'd helped evacuate was now a barren rock, its star having entered its death phase exactly as predicted. But orbiting nearby were 3 massive habitat stations, gleaming structures that represented the Alvarez new home. Beside him stood Commander Gene Park of the Sovereignty Observer Corps, a Morvathian whose tentacles were currently wrapped around a data tablet, reviewing the latest integration reports. Remarkable, Gene murmured, bioluminescence pulsing with what Kale had learned to recognize as impressed contemplation. The Alvarez have not only stabilized their population in the new habitats but have begun independent innovation. This agricultural synthesis they've developed, combining their traditional farming with zero-gravity hydroponics, it's genuinely novel. We could learn from this. That's the whole point, Kale replied with a smile. We didn't save them so they could become little humans. We saved them so they could become fully realized Alvarez. A chime indicated an incoming transmission. The viewport shimmered, replaced by the image of an Alvarez elder, a being resembling a terrestrial mantis but with iridescent wings that caught and refracted light in mesmerizing patterns. Ambassador Torrance, Commander Park, welcome, the elder spoke through translation matrices. I am Zenith 7 Rising, chosen to speak for the Alvarez Collective. We've been eager for your arrival. The honor is ours, Zenith 7 Rising, Kale replied. We're here for the quarterly assessment, but we're also just happy to see how you're doing. The Alvarez wings fluttered, their equivalent of a warm smile. Come. We have much to show you. And much to discuss. An hour later, Kale and Jean were touring the primary habitat station, accompanied by Zenith 7 Rising and a small delegation of Alvarez engineers, scientists, and cultural leaders. The interior was breathtaking, a careful blend of advanced technology and Alvarez aesthetic sensibilities. Curved walls mimicked the natural cave systems where their species had evolved. Bioluminescent plants from their homeworld had been adapted to provide lighting. Every design choice reflected a species honoring their heritage while embracing their future. The agricultural synthesis Commander Park mentioned, one of the Alvarez engineers explained, gesturing to vast hydroponic gardens, we developed it by combining human techniques with our traditional cultivation practices. But we've also added something new, symbiotic microorganism networks that increase yield by 40% while actually improving plant health. Impressive, Gene noted, updating his tablet. Have you published these findings? We're preparing a presentation for the next Sovereignty Science Symposium, Zenith 7 Rising replied. We hope to share our innovations with other species who might benefit. Paying forward as the humans taught us. They moved through educational facilities where young Alvarez learned both their traditional knowledge and new sciences. Through cultural centers where artists explored how zero-gravity environments might inspire new forms of expression. Through medical bays where Alvarez doctors worked alongside human advisors to adapt medical technologies for their unique physiology. But it was the final stop that truly moved Kale, a memorial hall dedicated to those who'd been lost during the evacuation. Not everyone had survived the transition. Accidents happened. Some elderly Alvarez had chosen to remain on their doomed world, preferring to die in the place of their birth. The memorial honored both the dead and the difficult choices that survival had required. "We do not forget the cost," Zenith 7 Rising said quietly, wings folded in a gesture of solemn respect. "Nor do we forget who helped us bear that cost. Humanity did not make our choices for us, did not spare us from difficult decisions, did not pretend that salvation would be painless. But you stood beside us when we made those choices. That is a gift beyond technology." Commander Jin's bioluminescence flickered with deep emotion. "This will be in my report to the Council. The Alvarez represent not dependency but partnership. Not corruption of natural development, but acceleration toward self-determined flourishing." Back aboard Compassion's Edge, Kale reviewed the day's findings with his senior staff while Jean compiled his official assessment. Dr. Sienna Roth, now heading the Human Sovereignty Integration Office, joined via quantum link from Earth. "The reports from the other intervention sites are equally positive," Sienna shared, her image floating in holographic form. "The Shendari are not only thriving but have made first contact with 2 neighboring civilizations. Peaceful contact, I should add, initiated with protocols we helped them develop. The Torvani successfully navigated a political crisis using conflict resolution frameworks we provided. Across all 7 initial interventions, we're seeing independent growth, cultural stability, and 0 instances of the weaponization or dependency the Council feared." "Not entirely 0, Kale corrected gently. "The Korthal situation has been challenging." Sienna nodded, her expression sobering. "True. The Korthal are struggling to integrate the medical technology we provided. There's been social disruption, debates about lifespan extension creating generational conflicts. But they're working through it with our support. It's messy but it's not catastrophic." "Messy but not catastrophic should be humanity's official motto," Jean observed wryly, his tentacles rippling with humor. "In all seriousness, Ambassador, the preliminary assessment is favorable. I'll be recommending to the Council that humanity's probationary status be affirmed and possibly extended to other volunteer species." A priority message chimed, High Arbiter Zelkinth requesting an immediate conference. Kale accepted, and the Morvathian's image appeared alongside Sienna's hologram. "Ambassador Torrance, Commander Park," Zelkinth greeted them. "I'm contacting you because the Council has received a petition that complicates our current framework." "What kind of petition?" Kale asked, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. Things had been going too smoothly. "From the governance of the Alvarez, the Shendari Collective and 4 other species that humanity has assisted," Zelkinth replied. "They've formally requested admission to the sovereignty as full member species." Kale and Jean exchanged surprised glances. This was years ahead of schedule. None of these civilizations had fully developed FTL capability yet, the traditional prerequisite for membership. "That's unprecedented," Kale said carefully. "Extremely," Zelkinth agreed. "They've argued that the traditional membership criteria are obsolete, that the ability to contribute to galactic civilization shouldn't be measured solely by independent FTL development. They point out that they possess technologies and insights the sovereignty lacks. The Alvarez agricultural synthesis. The Shendari's unique approach to asteroid mining that's 50% more efficient than our current methods. The Korthal's medical innovations." "What's the Council's position?" Sienna asked. Zelkinth's bioluminescence shifted through several complex patterns before settling into something Kale couldn't quite interpret. "The Council is divided," the High Arbiter admitted. "This is precisely the transformation Elder Counselor Vrnn predicted. If we accept these species as full members despite lacking traditional qualifications, we fundamentally alter what the sovereignty represents. If we reject them, we prove that our willingness to reconsider our protocols was merely performative." "It's more than that," Jean interjected. "If we reject them specifically because they were helped by humanity rather than developing independently, we're essentially punishing them for accepting aid. That would send a chilling message to any species considering our intervention programs." "Exactly the argument Matriarch Celis made," Zelkinth confirmed. "The younger species are rallying to support the petition. The older powers are resistant. War Marshal Drakhthan argues we're moving too fast, that these civilizations need more time to prove their stability. The Threnodai believe accepting them sets a dangerous precedent that will lead to dozens of unprepared species demanding membership." Kale considered carefully before responding. "High Arbiter, what's your personal view?" The question seemed to surprise Zelkinth. The Morvathian's tentacles curled inward in what Kale had learned to recognize as thoughtful uncertainty. I believe, Zelkinth said slowly, that humanity has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. We built the sovereignty on ideals of cooperation and mutual flourishing, but over time, those ideals calcified into rigid structures. We became more concerned with maintaining order than pursuing our founding purpose. The High Arbiter's bioluminescence shifted to a warm amber. The Alvarez petition isn't really about membership criteria. It's about whether we're willing to grow, to evolve, to remain true to what we claim to be. And if I'm being honest, Ambassador, I'm not certain we have the courage for that transformation. Then perhaps it's time to find that courage, Kale replied. The sovereignty stood at a crossroads 3 months ago when you could have simply expelled humanity and returned to comfortable stagnation. You chose the harder path: dialogue, experimentation, growth. This is the natural continuation of that choice. Natural for you, perhaps, Zelkinth said with what might have been affection. Humanity's comfort with chaos continues to unnerve my colleagues. But you may be right. Elder Counselor Vierwenen has already indicated he'll support the petition. If the Lumini back it, others may follow. What do you need from us? Sienna asked. Prepare testimony, Zelkinth replied. The council will convene in one standard month to hear arguments for and against the petition. The Alvarez and other petitioning species will speak for themselves, which is appropriate. But humanity's perspective will also be valuable, particularly regarding the readiness of these civilizations for full participation in galactic affairs. After Zelkinth signed off, Kale stood in silence, watching the Alvarez habitat stations drift past the viewport. Behind those gleaming walls were billions of beings who'd been given a second chance at survival, and were now asking for a voice in shaping the galaxy's future. We've started something we can't control, Jean observed quietly. You realize that? Good, Kale replied. Movements that can be controlled aren't really movements. They're just managed change. This is real transformation. It's messy and unpredictable and might fail spectacularly. But at least it's genuine. Very human, Jean said, and this time it clearly was affection in his bioluminescence. Very, very human. 1 month later, the Grand Chamber was packed beyond capacity. Every delegation had sent their maximum permitted representatives. Observer species who typically sent minimal representation had arrived in full force. Even civilizations not formally part of the sovereignty had sent envoys, curious about a debate that could reshape galactic politics. Zenith 7 Rising spoke first, representing the petitioning species. The Alvarez Elder stood before the assembled powers of the galaxy, wings spread in a gesture of open honesty. Honored members of the sovereignty, we come before you not to demand rights we haven't earned, but to offer contributions you haven't considered. The traditional membership criteria assume that value to this community is measured by independent achievement of specific technologies. We propose a different measure: the ability and willingness to contribute to our collective flourishing. Zenith 7 Rising proceeded to detail the innovations the petitioning species had developed. Some inspired by sovereignty technology, some entirely novel, all potentially valuable to the galactic community. We do not claim to be your equals in age or experience, the Alvarez continued. But we are your equals in dignity, in potential, and in commitment to the ideals this sovereignty supposedly represents. If those ideals are real, if this truly is a community rather than an exclusive club, then accept us as partners in building the future. The debate that followed was intense, passionate, and occasionally heated. War Marshal Drokthan made compelling arguments about the risks of lowering standards. The Threnodai Collective warned about the administrative burden of expanding membership too quickly. The Ashenter questioned whether species that had been helped could ever be truly independent. But Matriarch Celis countered with equal passion, pointing out that the Korthari's own admission had been delayed for decades by arbitrary criteria. The Velshera argued that diversity of developmental paths strengthened rather than weakened the sovereignty. The Mendari noted that independence was less valuable than interdependence, that reliance on each other was a feature of community, not a flaw. When humanity's turn came, Kale kept his remarks brief. The question before this council isn't whether the Alvarez and other petitioning species are ready for membership. The question is whether the sovereignty is ready to evolve. These civilizations have proven their capability, their resilience, and their commitment to partnership. If we reject them, we're not protecting standards, we're protecting our own comfort with the status quo. And comfort, honored delegates, is the enemy of greatness. Elder Counselor Vierwenen spoke last, as was tradition for the Lumini. 3,000 cycles ago, my ancestors helped found this sovereignty on a simple principle: that civilizations working together could achieve what none could accomplish alone. We've honored that principle in form but forgotten it in practice. These petitioning species offer us a chance to remember. I say we accept them, not despite their unconventional path to this chamber but because of it. They represent the future of what we could become: a true community of mutual support rather than a hierarchy of the independently successful. The vote was called. And as the delegations registered their positions, Kale watched history being made. The result was closer than he'd hoped but sufficient nonetheless. The petition was accepted. The Alvarez, Shendari, and 5 other civilizations would be admitted as full sovereignty members, with all rights and responsibilities that entailed. As the chamber erupted in a mixture of celebration and consternation, Kale felt Sienna's hand on his shoulder. "We actually did it," she whispered. "We changed the galaxy." "We started changing it," Kale corrected. "This is just the beginning." And looking around the grand chamber, at ancient species grappling with new ideas, at young civilizations claiming their place among the stars, at the beautiful chaos of genuine transformation, Kale knew he was right. The sovereignty would never be the same. And that, he thought with deep satisfaction, was exactly as it should be. Humanity had come to this chamber unbowed. Now the chamber itself was bending, slowly, reluctantly but genuinely, toward something closer to justice. Outside the station, stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of sentient beings. But within those walls of crystalline starlight, a new story was being written. One where mercy wasn't weakness, where compassion could be systematic, where helping others didn't diminish the helper but elevated everyone. One council chamber. Many empires. And humanity, unbowed, unbroken, and unrelenting in its insistence that the galaxy could be better. The future, uncertain and beautiful, stretched ahead.